In 1891, roughly 1,100 prisoners from Abashiri Prison cut about 160 kilometers of road across Hokkaido in less than a year. The route helped soldiers, settlers, and supplies reach the island's northeastern interior. It was praised as development, but the speed depended on chains, inadequate food, and lives the government considered expendable. This video will reveal what Abashiri Prison truly built, who paid the price, and how a prison on Japan's frozen frontier helped shape modern Hokkaido. Today, the name Abashiri Prison refers to two places that are easy to confuse. At the foot of Mount Tento stands Museum Abashiri Prison, an open-air museum preserving wooden buildings once used by the institution. Elsewhere in the city, a modern prison remains in operation under Japan's Ministry of Justice. One preserves the physical world of punishment from the Meiji era. The other continues the work of incarceration behind modern walls. But neither first appearance tells us why a prison was established here. The oldest surviving museum buildings date from after the institution's founding. When the first prisoners reached Abashiri in 1890, there was no great radial cell block waiting to receive them. The official name of the new facility was the Kushiro Prison Office Abashiri Prisoners' External Workstation. The cumbersome title described its purpose. It was an outpost for men sent beyond prison walls to perform state labor. Abashiri was then a small community on the northeastern edge of Hokkaido, facing the Sea of Okhotsk. Japanese settlement had expanded slowly in this region, separated from central Hokkaido by forest, mountains, and rivers. Ainu communities had lived across the island for generations, so government language about opening the land did not mean it was empty. It meant bringing the territory under a new network of Japanese administration, settlement, commerce, and military movement. That network required roads. The project associated most closely with Abashiri was known as the Central Road, also called the Katami Road along its eastern section. It was not one continuous modern highway laid down from coast to coast. It was a developing overland corridor intended to connect the Okhotsk region with routes leading toward the Hokkaido interior. From Abashiri, the eastern construction ran around Lake Abashiri, passed through areas that became Memenbetsu, Katami, Rubashib, Ikutahara, Engaru, and Maruseppu, and climbed toward Katami Pass. More than a century later, parts of that corridor survive within Hokkaido Prefectural Route 104, National Route 39, and National Route 333. Elsewhere, newer engineering shifted traffic away. A driver now passes farms, towns, and ordinary businesses. The journey no longer looks like a prison project, which is why its history can be difficult to see. The road changed what could move through northeastern Hokkaido. Officials, mail, and supplies could travel between settlements. Relay stations appeared along the route. Military farming communities, combining settlement with northern defense, entered districts previously difficult for the central government to reach. Merchants and farmers followed. The road did not create Hokkaido, but it accelerated the Japanese state's occupation and development of one of the island's least connected regions. Abashiri Prison was therefore more than a building beside a cold sea. It was part of the infrastructure itself. The prison gathered, confined, guarded, fed, and deployed the workforce that the government used to force the road through the eastern interior. The institution and the highway were born together. Without the road project, there was little reason to establish a penal station of that scale at Abashiri in 1890. Without the prisoners, officials would have faced the expense and delay of recruiting, paying, supplying, and retaining civilian workers in difficult terrain. This is the precise limit of the claim that Abashiri built Hokkaido. Its prisoners did not construct the entire island, and they were not the only coerced workers used during Hokkaido's transformation. Prisoners from Kabato, Sorachi, and Kushiro had already cleared roads, worked in mines, and opened land elsewhere. Paid laborers, military settlers, immigrant farmers, indigenous Ainu, and later exploited workers from Japan and abroad all became part of a much larger history. Giving Abashiri sole credit would replace one historical omission with another. Yet reducing its role too far would create a different distortion. The corridor from Abashiri toward Kitami Pass provided a foundation upon which later transportation and settlement could grow. Towns did not appear because of the road alone, but the road made their expansion possible. The prison did not build every farm, station, or commercial district that followed, but its captive workforce made it easier for the state to reach, administer, and populate the region. The preserved buildings at Museum Abashiri Prison can make the institution look fixed. Walls, gates, cells, and a guard position designed to watch several corridors at once. Its origin was more mobile. The men were confined at Abashiri so they could be marched away from it. As work advanced, temporary camps followed the construction into the forest. The prison extended beyond its walls through chains, guards, work crews, supply lines, and graves left beside the road. That is what Abashiri actually built, not Hokkaido in its entirety, but a strategic passage through its northeastern interior and a powerful instrument for extending state control. The achievement visible on a map cannot be separated from the method used to obtain it. The next question is therefore not how the prisoners cut the road. It is why government officials decided that prisoners should do the work at all. That decision began before Abashiri existed, during a period when the new Meiji government faced rebellion, crowded prisons, financial limits, and an urgent determination to secure Japan's northern frontier. In 1869, the Meiji government replaced the name Ezochi with Hokkaido. The change appeared on maps and official documents, but it represented more than new terminology. The government was turning the northern island into a territory to be surveyed, administered, settled, and connected to the rest of Japan. Hokkaido was not unoccupied. Ainu communities had long lived beside its rivers, forests, and coasts. They traded, hunted, fished, gathered plants, and maintained relationships with particular places through language, belief, and inherited knowledge. Many names still used across Hokkaido began as Ainu names. When officials described the island as undeveloped, they were measuring it against the farms, towns, roads, and tax systems the new state wanted to impose. Government surveys divided land into categories that could be claimed, granted, or sold. Expanding Japanese settlements restricted Ainu access to fishing grounds, hunting areas, and other sources of food. Officials also promoted cultural assimilation, treating Ainu practices as obstacles to national integration. The process celebrated in official language as development was therefore also a transfer of land, authority, and economic control. The Meiji leadership believed that the island had to be transformed quickly. Across the water lay territories contested with the Russian Empire, which was expanding its power in northeastern Asia. Japanese officials feared that a thinly connected Hokkaido would remain militarily vulnerable. Settlements could establish a permanent Japanese presence, but settlers required roads. Soldiers required routes for movement and supply. Ports and fishing communities needed dependable connections with the interior. Geography had become a national security problem. At the same time, the new government faced a crisis created by its own political transformation. The restoration of imperial rule had ended the old domain system and destroyed the privileged position of the samurai. Armed resistance followed. The Saga Rebellion erupted in 1874, and the much larger Satsuma Rebellion ended in 1877. Rural unrest and confrontations connected to the freedom and people's rights movement brought further arrests during the following decade. Not every prisoner produced by this period was a political opponent. Theft, robbery, murder, arson, and other serious crimes continued alongside rebellion and protest. Yet the combined result was a prison population that existing institutions struggled to contain. The government needed more space, and it wanted dangerous or long-term prisoners removed from heavily populated parts of the country. In 1879, Ito Hirobumi, one of the most influential leaders of the Meiji state, proposed sending prisoners to Hokkaido. Distance would make escape and return difficult. The island offered land for large institutions, while prison labor could be used for clearing forests, cultivating fields, mining resources, and building roads. Transportation and punishment became connected to colonization. The policy took physical form in 1881 with the opening of Kabato Prison in western Hokkaido. Sorachi Prison followed in 1882 near important coal deposits. Kushiro Prison opened in 1885 in the east. These were not ordinary local jails serving nearby towns. They were large, centralized prisons intended for men serving severe sentences, and their locations reflected the work the state expected them to perform. From them, prisoners were sent to clear land, build facilities, work dangerous mines, and open costly roads. The policy received one of its clearest justifications in 1885. Kaneko Kentaro, then serving as an advisor to Ito Hirobumi, toured Hokkaido and submitted reports on its administration and development. Kaneko argued that roads were essential for reaching resource-rich regions and strengthening government control. He also considered the financial problem of building them. Free workers would demand wages high enough to compensate for isolation, difficult terrain, and physical danger. They could leave if conditions became intolerable. Prisoners could not. Guards could compel them to work, and the state already controlled their food, housing, and movement. To Kaneko, this made convict labor an economical instrument. His argument went further than a comparison of wages. Kaneko described the prisoners as violent and wicked men who could be driven until they collapsed. If some died, he reasoned, the state would save the future cost of maintaining them. He also suggested that officials had less obligation to return their remains to their families than they would have toward free workers. It was an administrative proposal that treated human survival as an item in a public budget. The importance of this document does not lie in proving that every official thought exactly as Kaneko did. It reveals that extreme exploitation was not merely an accidental abuse committed far from supervision. A senior government advisor could present prisoner exhaustion and death as acceptable consequences of national development. By the late 1880s, penal policy and northern development had become one program, remote projects supplied by workers who could neither refuse nor leave. Abashiri was the next step in that program. Officials wanted a road approaching the Okhotsk coast from the interior, but the existing prisons were too distant from the eastern end of the planned route. The solution was to move prisoners closer to the work. In 1890, the policy conceived in government offices became a procession of human beings. Prisoners were transferred from Kushiro toward a small coastal community that had no established institution large enough to receive them. They arrived in restraints, under guard, and were ordered to begin by constructing the place that would confine them. The first prisoners sent to Abashiri did not enter a finished institution. They entered a work site beside the river. Groups of about 50 men were placed under guard, led into the surrounding forest, and ordered to cut the trees required for their own confinement. The timber became barracks and other buildings. As more groups arrived, the enclosure expanded until it could hold approximately 1,500 people. The men were constructing both a base for state expansion and a prison from which they could not leave. By the end of 1890, roughly 1,200 prisoners had been transferred from Kushiro. Their arrival was extraordinary in a settlement where the year-round settler population had remained small. The new institution brought not only prisoners but guards, administrators, and their families. Merchants followed the influx, opening shops and supplying food, tools, clothing, and everyday necessities. A penal outpost established for a road project began changing the scale and economy of Abashiri before that road had been completed. The prisoners were its most visible population. They wore reddish uniforms that distinguished them from guards and civilians. Iron restraints controlled their movement, particularly outside the enclosure. Men could be linked in pairs, limiting the chance that one could run without pulling another with him. The same chains that marked them as dangerous also turned ordinary movement into collective discipline. Behind the number 1,200 were men with different crimes, sentences, and histories. Later accounts often describe Abashiri as a destination for political prisoners created by the upheavals of the Meiji era. That image contains part of the wider history of Hokkaido's prison system, but it does not accurately describe the entire population sent to Abashiri. Central prisons elsewhere on the island did hold men convicted after rebellions, rural protests, and political movements. Surachi, in particular, became associated with political offenders. At Abashiri, however, surviving figures show a population dominated by men convicted of serious criminal offenses. Of approximately 1,200 prisoners recorded there in 1891, 628 were serving sentences for robbery. Other convictions included murder, attempted murder, sexual violence, and arson. Many were serving long terms, and some would never legally return home. Those records matter for two reasons. First, they prevent the prisoners from being recast as a single group of innocent political dissidents. Historical accuracy does not require erasing their crimes. Second, a conviction did not give the state unlimited authority over a prisoner's life. A sentence of confinement was not a license to impose labor under conditions likely to cause collapse, disease, or death. The government repeatedly blurred that distinction by presenting serious offenders as people whose survival mattered less. At Abashiri, punishment began before the road crews entered the interior. Prisoners built the compound that concentrated and controlled them. They cleared land, carried timber, and created the physical base from which they would later be deployed. Their labor also supported the expanding official community around the prison. The boundary between institution and settlement was therefore complicated from the beginning. Abashiri depended on the prison, while the prison depended on work extracted from the men it confined. The guards occupied a difficult position within that relationship. They were agents of a system designed to compel obedience, and they carried responsibility for preventing escape. Yet they also lived with their families in a remote community whose services were still developing. Their presence created demand for housing, commerce, and transportation. The prison was becoming an employer and population center, as well as a place of punishment. This growth altered how Abashiri related to the rest of Hokkaido. Before the penal station, the community had been connected mainly through coastal movement, fishing, and seasonal commerce. The new institution required regular supplies and official communication. It brought government personnel into the area and gave central authorities a permanent operational base. In effect, the prison began performing the administrative role that the road was intended to strengthen. The title External Workstation made the facility sound temporary. Its scale suggested otherwise. A compound designed to confine more people than the surrounding settlement could not remain a minor appendage for long. Within its first year, it was already functioning as a major prison, whatever the temporary title implied. The town and the institution grew together, each becoming increasingly difficult to imagine without the other. But the rapid construction at Abashiri was only preparation. The government had not transferred 1,200 men across Hokkaido merely to build barracks or support a growing settlement. The prison existed because a route had to be forced westward from the Okhotsk coast, and the available construction season was short. As the winter of 1890 gave way to spring, tools, guards, supplies, and prisoners were organized for the central road. The permanent compound beside the river would remain behind, but confinement would no longer depend on one fence. Temporary camps would advance with the work, carrying prison discipline deeper into the forest. By the spring of 1891, Abashiri was ready to become a moving prison. Work on the eastern section of the Central Road began on April 5, 1891. The government expected the route from Abashiri to Kitami Pass to be opened before the end of the year. That meant forcing approximately 161 kilometers of road through forest, wetlands, rivers, and mountain approaches during a single construction season. About 1,100 prisoners and more than 200 officials and guards were assigned to the project. The line began near Abashiri, past the western side of Lake Abashiri and the area that became Memon-Betsu, then continued through the future centers of Kitami and Rubishibe. Farther west, it crossed the districts later known as Ikutahara, Engaru, Maruseppu, and Shirataki before climbing toward Kitami Pass. The distance made it impossible to send every crew out from the main prison each morning. Officials divided the work into successive sections. When one section advanced, prisoners were moved forward, and temporary quarters were erected closer to the new cutting face. The camp, the guards, the restraints, and the daily regime traveled with them. This was why the system became known as a moving prison. The quarters were not ordinary construction cabins. Prisoners dug down approximately 60 to 90 centimeters, raised walls from logs and boards, and left an earthen passage through the center. A toilet stood at the end without a partition. There was only one doorway, making movement easier to observe and escape harder to attempt. Logs fixed along the sleeping platform served as pillows. Each man received a thin quilt that could be folded around his body at night. These structures provided confinement more reliably than comfort. As soon as a work section was finished, the men had to abandon one camp, move west, and build another. The process consumed energy before the next length of road had even been cleared. It also ensured that prison surveillance remained present when the crews were many miles from Abashiri. Outside the quarters, iron restraints organized the workforce. Prisoners could be chained in pairs, a system intended to make escape difficult in open country. One man could not change pace, step around an obstacle, or fall without affecting the person attached to him. A device meant for security, therefore, shaped every physical movement required by the work. The road itself was made largely by hand. Crews felled trees, cut branches, pulled or dug out roots, shifted stones, leveled uneven ground, and opened passages across streams. Axes, hoes, picks, baskets, ropes, and human strength did work later performed by engines. Where the line met water, crews had to form crossings and bridge narrow channels. The objective was not to produce a paved highway of modern dimensions. It was to create a usable corridor wide and stable enough for people, horses, carts, official traffic, and supplies. Speed governed the operation. Museum accounts describe work continuing from early morning into the night. The deadline did not move when crews encountered dense timber, saturated ground, steep grades, or damaged tools. Nor did the restraints disappear when the labor demanded balance and coordinated strength. Each delay increased pressure on the men assigned to the next section. As the moving camps pushed inland, they also moved farther from dependable supply points. Food had to travel over the same incomplete route the prisoners were constructing. Medicine and replacement equipment faced similar delays. A shortage near Abashiri could be corrected from the established compound. A shortage deep in the mountains could remain unresolved while the work continued. The imbalance grew with every mile. Labor demands remained high while the quality and regularity of food declined. Injuries that might have been manageable near the main prison became more serious at a temporary camp. Men weakened by inadequate nutrition were still expected to clear timber and move earth at the pace required by the schedule. The moving prison allowed construction to advance, but it steadily reduced the protections available to the people doing it. For the government, the urgency had strategic value. The completed corridor would connect the Okhotsk coast with the interior road network. Officials and military units could move through the region more reliably. Mail and freight could reach new settlements. Relay stations offering horses, lodging, and postal services would soon appear along the route. Military farming families and other settlers could enter districts that had been difficult to supply. On December 27, 1891, the Central Road was declared complete. The achievement was striking, but its speed cannot be explained as an engineering triumph alone. It depended on a captive workforce that could not reject the deadline, leave the job, or demand safer conditions. Chains maintained discipline, temporary camps extended confinement, and the state accepted declining health as the cost of continued progress. The road moved west until the planned corridor was open. The men did not endure at the same rate. By the time the work approached the mountains, illness, malnutrition, injury, and exhaustion were removing prisoners from the crews faster than the system could restore them. The next record of the Central Road would not be measured only in distance. It would be measured in deaths, disputed totals, and graves scattered beside the route. The prisoners who died on the Central Road were not normally returned to their families. Many were buried near the work camps or beside the corridor they had been forced to open. The road continued forward, leaving graves behind it. The surviving records do not support a simple claim that most of these men froze to death. Abashiri's cold intensified suffering, but disease and malnutrition appear more often in the documentation. As supply lines lengthened, diets became inadequate for men performing sustained heavy labor. Their bodies weakened while the schedule remained unchanged. Beriberi was a recurring danger. Caused by a severe deficiency of thiamine, it can damage the nerves and heart and produce weakness. Records and later studies also describe edema, the swelling caused by fluid collecting in the body. These were not mysterious illnesses produced by the landscape. They were closely connected to nutrition, exhaustion, and the conditions under which the prisoners were kept. Injuries added another layer. Axes, picks, falling timber, rocks, rough crossings, and chained movement created constant opportunities for harm. A wound suffered near Abashiri might receive treatment. At a temporary camp deep along the unfinished road, medical help and supplies were limited. A man weakened by illness could not simply stop working, negotiate a lighter task, or leave the camp to recover. Some deaths followed direct violence. Museum accounts and other histories state that guards could kill prisoners who resisted or attempted to escape. Surviving instructions cited by researchers describe orders to execute fugitives rather than allow them to disappear into the interior. Yet the documentation does not provide a dependable total for such killings. The evidence cannot be omitted, but the records do not support a precise total. Even the overall death toll remains unsettled. Prison statistics recorded 188 deaths from disease associated with Abashiri during this period. That figure is significant because it comes from an institutional category, but it is not necessarily a complete count of everyone who died during the road project. It excludes deaths recorded under other causes and may not resolve where each person died or whether every case resulted directly from road labor. Other researchers have reached different totals. The historian Daniel Botsman has used 186. The Central Road exhibit at Museum Abashiri Prison uses 211. Some residents and researchers connected with Rubashaib have argued for 238. None of these figures can simply be declared final without explaining what each source includes. The disagreement does not mean that the scale of death is unknowable. Juhi Solis, comparing prison statistics, museum interpretation, and local research, concludes that roughly 1/5 of the prisoners at Abashiri probably died during the Central Road project. The uncertainty concerns the precise total, not whether the loss was extraordinary. There are several reasons exact accounting is difficult. Records categorized deaths differently. Some totals count only prisoners, while broader commemorative figures may include guards or other personnel. Disease, injury, execution, and disappearance were not always preserved in the same form. Men buried along a moving work site could be separated from the institution that held their names. Grave markers deteriorated, and some burial locations were forgotten. Local memory preserved what official accounting did not. According to tradition, chains were sometimes placed near graves as markers. At a burial site in Tano, later called Chain Mound, excavations uncovered human remains with iron restraints still attached to the leg bones. The discovery did not prove every story told about every grave, but it established that at least some prisoners had been buried in their restraints. The meaning of those restraints reached beyond the manner of burial. The men had already been sentenced by courts to confinement or long terms of punishment. On the road, they were exposed to a second system in which survival could depend on a construction schedule. Critics began asking whether prisoners were being subjected to an additional penalty never formally imposed by a judge. That challenge went to the center of government policy. The deaths were not the result of one unexpected storm, one incompetent guard, or one isolated failure of supply. The state had selected prisoners because they could be compelled to accept conditions that free workers might reject. Kaneko Kentaro's earlier reasoning had openly treated prisoner exhaustion and death as financially tolerable. The road project converted that logic into administration. Public and political criticism eventually made the system harder to defend. In 1894, the government ended the use of prisoners for external development labor of this kind in Hokkaido. The decision did not abolish prison work. Men continued to labor inside institutions, in workshops, agriculture, construction, and other controlled settings. What ended was the policy of deploying large convict forces into remote projects under the model that had produced the Prisoners' Road. The Central Road remained open. Relay stations and settlements expanded along it, and the state retained the strategic access it had demanded. The prisoners who died did not receive the same immediate recognition. For decades, many remained names in institutional records, uncertain totals in local histories, or bodies beneath weathered ground. Abashiri Prison also remained. With the emergency road project finished and external labor curtailed, the institution adapted rather than closed. Its next history would be written in farms, workshops, fire, reconstruction, and a new architecture designed to keep every corridor under observation. When the road crews were withdrawn, Abashiri did not return to being a temporary outpost. The moving camps disappeared, but the institution stayed. Fields and farm buildings replaced forest work sites. The prison sought to produce its own food, reduce confinement costs, and make agriculture part of its disciplinary routine. Abashiri had changed its purpose, but not the principle that prisoners should be made economically useful. That transition became visible at Futamigaoka, west of town. Established in 1896, the branch farm was organized around cultivation and self-sufficiency. Prisoners cleared and worked the land, tended crops, prepared food, and maintained the buildings needed to support the site. The surviving administration building, cell house, and kitchen date from that first year. Together they document an unusual prison complex organized around a farm rather than a mobile construction camp. Prison officials described regular labor as a means of teaching order, skill, and obedience. At Abashiri, however, reform and extraction were difficult to separate. The institution that claimed work could prepare a prisoner for release also controlled its hours, pace, products, and value. Agriculture, forestry, and manufacturing diversified the prison economy, but prisoners remained a captive labor force. The institution was becoming permanent. In 1903, it officially became Abashiri Prison. The new name acknowledged what had already happened. A workstation created for one road project had become a lasting arm of the state, with farms, workshops, staff, rules, and a fixed relationship to the surrounding community. Then, in 1909, fire exposed how much of that institution still depended on wood. Flames began in a straw processing workshop. Driven by strong winds, they spread through cell blocks, offices, factories, and storehouses. Most of the prison was destroyed. One solitary cell building reportedly remained standing, while the principal structures were reduced to ashes. The disaster did not end Abashiri. It gave the government an opportunity to redesign it. The Ministry of Justice prepared the plans, and prisoners helped carry out the reconstruction. By 1912, a new administration building and cell complex were complete. Its defining feature was a central observation station with 5 long cell house wings radiating outward. From the center, guards could look down several corridors without walking their full length. The design concentrated sight, movement, and authority in one position, allowing limited numbers of officers to supervise many prisoners. The surviving 5-wing cell house is now recognized as the only complete wooden radial cell block of its kind remaining in Japan. Its value lies not only in its form, but in what that form reveals. Doors, corridors, inspection points, and sight lines turned surveillance into part of the building. A prisoner did not have to see a guard to know one might be watching. Punishment cells added another degree of isolation, while bells, counts, meals, work periods, and inspections divided every day into institutional time. The rebuilt prison was technologically advanced for the region. Boilers supplied heated water to the kitchen, wash areas, and a concrete bathhouse. Steam generating equipment provided electric light to the administration building and cell houses, reportedly the first in Abashiri. Yet modernization did not mean personal freedom. Bathing was organized in groups under command and completed according to a strict sequence. Light extended the institution's capacity to supervise. A boiler could improve sanitation while making a large confined population easier to manage. The rebuilding created a central contradiction. Abashiri was newly rebuilt, more efficient, and better equipped than the rough compound of 1890. It was also more capable of regulating prisoners from morning until night. Road gangs had used chains and mobile camps to impose discipline across distance. The permanent prison used architecture, schedules, work assignments, and observation to control people within walls and fields. Outside the walls, one local figure confronted a problem the official system could not solve. Teranaga Hosen, a Buddhist priest, began assisting released prisoners in 1894 after hearing a former inmate describe their circumstances. Many had no family nearby, money for the journey home, or prospect of employment. Teranaga visited the prison, offered religious instruction, and gradually provided food, shelter, medical help, and assistance finding work. His efforts eventually became an organized relief institution for former prisoners. His work reveals what the language of rehabilitation concealed. A prisoner could complete a sentence and still emerge isolated, impoverished, and marked by confinement. The prison trained people to labor under command, but release required choices, relationships, and resources that discipline could not provide. Teranaga's support did not erase coercion. It demonstrated that returning to society demanded something different from obedience inside prison. By the end of the Second World War, Abashiri was no longer merely the place from which a deadly road crew had departed. It was a durable agricultural and production prison, rebuilt with modern systems and an architecture of constant supervision. The institution had exchanged the moving chain gang for fields, workshops, cell blocks, and schedules, while preserving control over prisoners' time, bodies, and labor. But after the war, this was not how most Japanese people first encountered Abashiri. Central Road, Futamigaoka, and the debate over forced labor were displaced by a dramatic image of snow, chains, dangerous convicts, and escape. That new Abashiri was created not by prison administrators, but by the movies. In 1965, Abashiri Prison became a national image. The film Abashiri Prison, directed by Teruo Ishii and starring Ken Takakura, placed a recognizable prison name inside a story of loyalty, danger, and escape. Its central characters were handcuffed together across a winter landscape. Snow, iron restraints, railway tracks, and isolated terrain gave the film an identity audiences remembered even if they knew nothing about Hokkaido's Central Road. The film was a major success and established Takakura as one of Japan's defining screen stars. The studio moved quickly, releasing 4 entries during 1965 alone, and keeping both Takakura and the Abashiri name before audiences throughout the year. Ishii directed 10 films in the original cycle from 1965 through 1967. A later series continued as New Abashiri Prison into the early 1970s. Some installments traveled far from Hokkaido, but the name still promised hardened men, criminal codes, confinement, violence, and escape. Cinema did not invent Abashiri's cold, isolation, or chains. It selected those elements and changed their meanings. In the films, chains bound characters together during an adventure. Winter tested courage and loyalty. Escape created suspense. In the record of 1891, chains enforced labor, while isolation obstructed food, medicine, and scrutiny. The same objects supported 2 different stories. This distinction matters because popular accounts can blend fictional escapes with real prison history. Abashiri held dangerous offenders, and documented escape attempts belong to its history. But cinema cannot prove a specific event. The series was drama, not testimony. Its blizzards and fugitives made Abashiri famous without explaining why the prison existed or how men died building the road. For the city, fame brought benefits. The films made Abashiri recognizable across Japan and gave travelers another reason to visit northern Hokkaido. Local institutions later honored Ishii for increasing the city's visibility. But a tourist identity built around notorious prisoners could push their labor into the background. The public associated Abashiri with escape before it associated the prison with state policy. At the same time, another interpretation was developing within Hokkaido. During the 1960s, scholars, teachers, and residents joined a broader people's history movement. They challenged narratives that celebrated modernization through railways, roads, farms, and factories, while treating their laborers as secondary. A major history published in 1968 placed workers, including forced laborers, near the center of Hokkaido's development. The book directly challenged official celebrations of the Meiji centennial, arguing that roads praised as progress could not be understood apart from coercion. This extended beyond academic debate. Local groups searched records, followed the old road, investigated burial places, and asked why so many graves remained unidentified. In 1968, residents completed a memorial near Futamigaoka for those who died constructing the national road. Further monuments followed in 1974 and 1976. At Chain Mound, an excavation uncovered human remains with chains and fetters attached to the leg bones. Its memorial made coercion impossible to separate from development. Buddhist nun Hayashi Ryuko became a persistent advocate for locating graves, recovering remains, and giving the dead proper rites. Local historical societies joined searches along the old route beginning in 1982. Even the words on monuments became a historical argument. Some residents described the prisoners as pioneers or contributors to Hokkaido. Several memorials called the dead martyrs, emphasizing that their deaths had served a nation that failed to honor them. Others objected that martyrs suggested voluntary sacrifice. These men had not chosen the road, schedule, or conditions. For that reason, victim increasingly appeared more accurate. The debate did not deny the crimes for which the prisoners had been sentenced. It changed the question. Instead of judging whether the men deserved imprisonment, residents examined the state's obligations after taking away their freedom. A conviction authorized lawful confinement and punishment. It did not make a prisoner's life available for an infrastructure project without limit. In local memory, the men were no longer only offenders. They were also people subjected to a policy that accepted preventable deaths. While this reevaluation continued, the prison's physical survival became uncertain. In 1972, officials announced a complete modernization of the active facility. The wooden buildings had become obsolete for contemporary incarceration, and replacement threatened them with demolition. Sato Hisashi, owner of the Abashiri newspaper, argued for preservation. Other residents joined him because the buildings could teach future generations how the institution had shaped the city. On May 28, 1980, citizens established the Abashiri Prison Preservation Foundation. Saving the complex required moving historic structures across the Abashiri River to land near Mount Tento, where they became an open-air museum. In 1983, Museum Abashiri Prison opened to the public. By then, two Abashiris existed in Japanese memory. Cinema created a frozen stage of shackled fugitives and dangerous men. Local research recovered a landscape of forced labor, disputed graves, and citizens struggling to name the dead accurately. Preservation brought those histories together, but did not decide which one visitors would remember. A building can survive demolition and still lose its meaning. Once Abashiri became a museum, preservation created a new responsibility. Would the site protect remarkable architecture, trade on the films, or explain what the state demanded from prisoners along Central Road. The answer would determine whether the frozen prison remained a legend or became evidence. Visitors today can enter the five-wing cell house completed in 1912, but those cells no longer belong to the prison now confining people in Abashiri. The city holds two institutions with similar names and different purposes. Museum Abashiri Prison preserves the wooden complex near Mount Tento. The modern Abashiri Prison remains active at a separate site. Confusing them creates a false picture of present imprisonment. The museum opened in 1983 after historic structures were moved from the old prison grounds and restored. Its open-air campus contains 25 buildings, including historic structures moved from prison sites and later reconstructions. A reconstructed bathhouse demonstrates a vanished routine, while the administration building, lecture hall, Futamigaoka farm buildings, and radial cell house preserve material from the institution itself. Together, they document punishment, labor, farming, surveillance, and administration. On February 9, 2016, 8 buildings grouped within 4 historic properties were designated Important Cultural Properties of Japan. They include the administration building, the prison house and observation station, the lecture hall, and 5 buildings from the Futamigaoka branch. Their value is not based on notoriety. They are rare surviving examples of wooden prison architecture from Japan's institutional modernization. Preservation remains a continuing process. As of July 2026, seismic reinforcement and conservation work continues in the first and third wings of the radial cell house. The second, fourth, and fifth wings remain open, with digital access provided for closed areas. Saving a wooden prison requires technical care and a continuing agreement that difficult history deserves physical space. Architecture alone cannot explain Central Road. Museum exhibits place tools, restraints, temporary quarters, and forced labor beside the buildings. Its interpretation describes those who died as victims, reflecting language developed by local history movements. The chain appears not as a movie prop, but as an instrument restricting movement while prisoners felled trees, shifted stone, and opened the road. The memorial landscape extends beyond the museum. Chain Mound lies near the former route, and other monuments stand along the old corridor. Different groups erected them in different decades and used different language. Some honor martyrs, others identify victims. Their scattered locations reflect how the deaths occurred, not in one catastrophe, but across camps, work sections, burial places, and months of preventable decline. The active prison tells another part of the story. It occupies roughly 1,640 hectares, the largest prison grounds in Japan. It continues crop farming and is the country's only prison engaged in livestock raising and forestry. Prisoners also perform woodworking, metalwork, sewing, ceramics, and other production. This is a contemporary correctional system, not the emergency road regime of 1891. Yet Abashiri's identity as an agricultural and productive prison survived the conversion of its wooden buildings into exhibits. What, then, did the prison build? Central Road gave the Meiji government a corridor between the Okhotsk coast and Hokkaido's interior. Relay stations appeared along the route. Military settler families later entered districts made easier to reach, supply, and administer. Commerce and civilian settlement followed broader policies, while later transportation networks changed the region again. The road did not cause every development, but it made state expansion into eastern Hokkaido faster and more durable. That expansion did not enter an empty land. Ainu communities had long lived across Hokkaido, with their own place names, trade, social relationships, and systems of hunting, fishing, and gathering. When official histories said roads opened or developed Hokkaido, they described the advance of the Japanese state and settler economy, not the beginning of human history there. Any account of what Abashiri built must acknowledge whose land was being reorganized. The title can now be answered precisely. Abashiri Prison did not build Hokkaido by itself. Its prisoners built an essential section of a strategic corridor that helped the state control, settle, and supply the Northeast. Other prisoners, paid laborers, settlers, engineers, indigenous communities, and later generations also shaped Hokkaido. Reducing that history to one prison would repeat the erasure that made the original story incomplete. Recognition must not become praise for voluntary sacrifice. The prisoners' labor had lasting consequences, but they did not freely offer themselves to a national project. They were serving criminal sentences and were compelled to work under conditions the state knew were dangerous. Calling them contributors recognizes what their labor produced. Calling them victims identifies the coercion and accepted deaths that produced it. The descriptions can coexist only if the second is never hidden behind the first. Modern vehicles still follow sections of the corridor opened in 1891. They cross distances that once separated moving prison camps from food, medicine, and oversight. Nearby memorials ask travelers to stop treating the road as anonymous infrastructure. The surface carries traffic. Its history carries lost names, graves beside the route, and the policy that made both seem expendable. That is what makes Abashiri's memory unfinished. The museum saved buildings, exhibits restored forced labor to the narrative, and communities marked graves the state neglected. Preservation is meaningful only when prisoners are seen in full. As people convicted of crimes, as laborers denied the power to refuse, and as victims of a policy that separated progress from its human cost. The frozen prison helped build a road, and that road extended the reach of modern Japan. What remains beside it is a harder measure of development, whether a nation can preserve past achievements without abandoning the people beneath them.